Bonsoir à toutes et à tous, merci d'être venus chez Caribe ce soir. On est extrêmement heureux d'accueillir James Morrow. Alors je pense que la plupart d'entre vous connaissent bien James Morrow et son œuvre. Je vais quand même en dire quelques mots très rapidement avant qu'on rentre dans le vif du sujet. Donc James Morrow est né il y a quelques années à Philadelphie, en Pennsylvanie. C'est pas un hasard, parce que la Pennsylvanie est quand même un état assez particulier, et William Penn est quand même quelqu'un qui, dans les thématiques qu'explore au long de son œuvre, James Morrow en fait joue un rôle important. Alors il se définit souvent lui-même, non pas au hasard, parce qu'il n'y a jamais de hasard, mais au fil des interviews comme un humaniste scientifique. Et tous ceux qui ont pratiqué son œuvre, je pense, réalisent à quel point c'est juste sur les deux composantes. Après, humanisme est un terme effectivement qui est extraordinairement multivoque, donc on en reparlera sûrement dans le courant de la soirée. Il va y avoir beaucoup de choses qui se cachent dans l'humaniste. Une chose qui est claire, en tout cas, c'est que ces romans, quelle que soit leur forme, et on en reparlera, ont à cœur en fait d'attraper au corps et de nous faire rire et réfléchir autour de tout l'obscurantisme possible, c'est-à-dire de tout ce qui est non scientifique et souvent, il faut bien le dire, assez religieux. Alors, James Morrow, son premier roman date de 1981, donc en français c'était Le vin de la violence, et son dernier traduit en français c'est L'Arche de Darwin, donc qui est de 2015, qui vient d'obtenir le Grand Prix de l'Imaginaire 2018, donc pour la deuxième fois, puisque En remorquant Jéhovah l'avait obtenu en 1996. Le tout dernier roman, donc je pense sera très prochainement traduit au Diable Vauvert, enfin j'en suis sûr, qui s'appelle The Asylum of Dr. Caligari, dont on dira un mot certainement tout à l'heure. Donc voilà, je vais pas ni raconter ni résumer les 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Et il y en a un en fait qui ne figure pas là, 15 romans de James Morrow, plus un grand nombre de nouvelles. Et donc, without much ado, I will just say welcome to James Morrow, and we will go to the first question.
Okay.
If you are okay.
Bonsoir à tous.
So James speaks French and understands French, but he would prefer for the sake of accuracy
Oui.
to speak in English. So my first question will be, that's not provocative, but that's really an interrogation. You have been writing mostly in the field, in the publishing field of science fiction and or fantasy, while most of your thematics are not that common in science fiction and fantasy, and as I think you mentioned in some interviews a few years ago, your first inclination was clearly about social and religious satire, and some of the obvious figures in that way were probably people more like Mark Twain or Kurt Vonnegut or Joseph Heller.
Jonathan Swift, Voltaire.
Yeah, and you have been inscribed in the sci-fi field. So I would like to know how did it happen, and with the a few years of reflection, what do you think of that pros and cons of being inscribed in the sci-fi field?
Je pense que mes romans sont toujours les expériences de pensée, the thought experiments. Je suis peut-être un philosophe manqué. Je suis enfant de l'âge de raison, le siècle des Lumières, comme Diderot, Montesquieu. But science fiction has given me a home and a living wage and des prix. C'est un prix de science-fiction pour l'Arche de Darwin. les politiques les éditeurs dans les États-Unis, très compliqué. And my novels were typically presented, at least in the hardcover edition, as mainstream literature. But they only were embraced by the science fiction community. And they only found paperback editions, book club editions, reprints of all sorts as genre. So science fiction, c'est mon maison, mon roman, mon troisième roman, Ainsi finit le monde. Peu comme Vonnegut, satiric, it's a comedy about World War III. And the reviews were marvelous, but when they had the auction for the paperback edition, only science fiction editors were interested. I think it's because what I love about science fiction is when you join the science fiction union, you're given this a toolkit, une boîte utile, and you get to do time travel, and you get to do aliens from other worlds, and you get to do alternative universes. For me, these are very philosophical concepts, but the mainstream editors dans les États-Unis say, well, this is genre, this is fantasy, c'est impossible. So, but I can't complain because I've found a readership. But I am, to be sure, I did not find science fiction. I did not read it comme enfant. Je n'ai pas lu la science fiction, mais la science fiction me a trouvé.
Yeah, science fiction found you.
Yeah, science fiction a trouvé moi. Oui.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that are really impressive when one reads your novels. That's it's really very philosophical, very satirical, very funny, always very funny. But that with that paradox, which is not that common, of being very funny and very serious. One of the things that I think is the most impressive is the quantity of philosophical data you are putting in your books. And one of the examples, probably, I think I will probably read in a few minutes a short excerpt of Towing Jehovah. But with the Godhead trilogy, a normal reader who is not especially fond of the scientific attempt of scientific proof of the existence of God, or the ontological argument of the existence of God, or I would like to mention one you didn't use, but it's very nice, which is the ornithological argument by George Louis Borges.
The birds?
Yes, very, very nice.
Preuve des oiseaux?
No, it's a variation of course, of the ontological argument, but it's something like, it should be it's in L'auteur et autres textes.
C'est ton idée de Borges?
De Borges, yes.
Okay.
And it was a very short poem with something like, there are birds on a branch. There is a finite number of birds, but I don't know how many, but somebody knows how many are, and that somebody is God. It was something
très drôle.
Totally crazy.
Borgesian, right.
Je pense peut-être mes romans sont un peu comme le cheval de
The Troy.
Trois.
what? The wooden
Trojan.
horse.
Trojan
Trojan
horses.
horse.
Oui.
Trojan horse.
It's a way, parce que j'aime beaucoup mes idées politiques, philosophiques, satiriques. J'ai beaucoup de problèmes avec les églises, avec les religions. So I use the science fiction conventions and my sense of humor and my attempt to entertain to sort of sneak my ideas into the chrono, the lecture. The reader lowers his defenses while laughing and encounters my ideas. I have no interest in telling anyone what to think, but I like to believe I'm giving readers thoughts they've never had before, such as the ornithological proof
No,
of
but,
God.
That was really, you mentioned the thought experiments, which is
Oui,
probably
l'expérience
one of
pensée,
these strong, for me at least, but one with this strong basis and ultimate justifications of the whole science fiction. It's really to project things and to what if things were.
Yeah.
To me, how can I speculate
What if?
about if God exists? What if he dies?
Yeah.
It's something massive, but if you are very thoroughly, and one of the adjectives probably I will use a lot tonight is tough, because you are incredibly tough in your management of data and of intricacy of things and of the materials, of various materials. But with that first thing, that okay, that's it's not a spoiler. That's the very beginning of the Godhead trilogy, when some archangel in a monastery is finding a tanker captain who is haunted by nightmares because he thinks he's responsible for one of the worst oil disasters, oil spills in the history, with hundreds of thousands of birds killed, of whales, of seals killed, crabs, and he is very full of culpability. And worse, his father of his captain is himself a tanker commander and has been teasing him, saying, "You're really, what can I say?" And so the guy is that, and an archangel comes and say, "I will probably need your help because God is dead and is floating somewhere in the Gulf of Guinea, and we can't let him, with a H, of course, capital H, we can't let him there floating among sharks and birds shitting on him and everything you can imagine. We have to tow him in a very nice cache we built in some icebergs near the Svalbard. So please, will you help us?" And of course, the captain is, but the Vatican is involved. And in 20 pages, you have something totally crazy that is beginning, but that will develop itself in a kind of cathedral, no pun intended, with yes, okay, God is dead, or maybe he's only comatose. In the second volume, we are not so sure he's
Le
dead.
jugement de Jehovah. I think l'idée centrale de On remarquant Jéhovah, c'est une idée terrible. On dit très mauvais pour un roman. Donc, il faut que I had to live with that book and that premise for 3 years, for 3 années. écrit encore une fois, écrit encore une fois. Adding, you were speaking of the technical details, a great deal of research, and I think scientific integrity goes into my books. I interviewed people who had worked sur les grands bateaux, les grands bateaux de
Supertank.
Supertankers.
the supertanker, and so I eventually came to believe that this absurd event, this embarrassingly bald and extreme situation had actually occurred. But I had to live inside the book for 3 années and tous les détails. So it's a fusion de la fantasy et de la science-fiction, peut-être.
One of the fascinating things, but I have to mention for eventually for the people who didn't read Towing Jehovah, we are speaking of supertankers because the corpse is 3 kilometers long.
Oui.
So you cannot do that even with the best of the icy towing boats. It will make it. You need something bigger. One or several supertankers eventually. But one thing which is totally incredible is I'm personally totally convinced that James Morrow made calculations to determine what is the resistance of the ears of God when he is towed by a supertanker. Because there are situations where it means something. Will it break or not when you tow it by the ears? So that's something that is incredible. So, yes, I think one of the great experiences the reader can have when reading most of your book. I didn't read all of them, but only a few of them. But it's really that sheer passion for demonstration, argumentation, people presenting their arguments, their conclusions, their thesis, and counter-thesis. And there is something that in any other context will be very over-talkative. People will be really speaking. And you have that magic touch to merge that into something that is really a novel and it is fun and it is not people discussing of existence of God. And the second volume of the Godhead trilogy, in French it's Le Jugement de Jéhovah, which is totally different from the English title.
Blameless in
Abaddon. That was great, but because the angle chosen by the publishers is totally different. That's true that that second volume is about one particular person, an American judge, elected judge, like it is the case in the US, for various reasons that are complex and very interesting, decides that he wants to put that corpse, which is now maybe not so dead than comatose, in front of the what is it in English?
The World Court.
TPI,
International
en français.
International Court of Justice.
In The Hague.
In the Hague, and he will put him like he was some ordinary war criminal for crimes against humanity. And then it's really it's a legal thriller, actually. It might have been some John Grisham thing, but it's made in a way where we are judging the corpse of God, and one thing, and that is a spoiler, but that is a spoiler that came after 20 pages, so I think it's not a spoiler. But some scientists, by sheer interest for science, but also out of curiosity, and are investigating the brain of God in the corpse. And in that brain, you have, of course, all the ideas in the Platonician sense of the concepts of everything.
Plato.
They are in that brain. Even if the thing didn't really exist. And you have notably somebody with the devil, who is not the devil like we could imagine it, is some kind of tailor, stitching all the things.
Satan.
Yeah, and is mischievous, is the devil.
Fait les vêtements.
And
Satan.
people are going in that brain, or where every brain artery is like the Grand Canyon. It's gigantic, of course, and it takes days and weeks to go from a place to another one. And so it's something like if Asimov had been a writer, he could have made something with the Fantastic Voyage with that. Instead, we had what we know.
C'est un type de voyage fantastique, but avec beaucoup de philosophie.
Because
Philosophy et beaucoup.
Every critical encounter in that brain is giving hints to the main character, to the plaintiff, is giving hints of how to fight some proof of God's existence that will be bring in the egg by the best theologians in the world, by people of incredible culture, philosophical culture, and you have southern culture. I will not say who is encountering, but that's something totally different from the first volume.
C'est le jugement de Jéhovah. C'est un roman au sujet de leur problème de mal. Oui. C'est en version moderne de le livre de Job, de Bible. C'est Job dans les vêtements modernes. And again, I did enough research to convince myself that this could actually be happening. I learned about how the World Court, the Court du Monde, the International Court of Justice, operates in The Hague. And I learned about all of the defenses, all of the rationalizations, the
Theodicies.
Theodicies. Comme Dr. Pangloss, Leipzig, oui, Theodicy.
Yeah.
Candide.
Yeah.
Candide, yeah.
Pangloss, Candide,
Leibniz.
William Leibniz. So there's the ontological defense and the free will defense and the afterlife defense and the hidden harmony defense, etc. So, but as you're saying, for me, I always put a premium on being entertaining. Come, Monty Python, where there's also a love of ideas and philosophy. A book come Woody Allen. But because I think the worst sin is to bore the reader. I think that all art is entertainment. It doesn't work the other way around. Not all entertainment is art. No. J'aime les films les super-héros de Marvel et DC, mais ce n'est pas des objets d'art.
You don't like them that much.
I will just read the very beginning of chapter 2 of Torin Joa, because that's one of my favorite characters, of course. And I think that's also one of your favorite characters, Thomas Wycliffe Ockham. Because one interesting thing, it's the case in most of the books, that Of course, it's against obscurantism and the dark side of religion, which is most of it. But every time you have some religious people that are very not only honest but smart and willingful to make things progress in a way. And that's chapter 2, so there is no spoiler, but I will say that, of course, in French.
D'accord.
Thomas Wycliffe Occam, un homme bon, un homme qui aimait Dieu, les idées, les classiques du cinéma, et ses frères de la Compagnie de Jésus, se frayait un chemin à travers la foule de la station de métro 7e avenue, manœuvrant prudemment son attaché-caisse parmi l'encombrement de pelvis et de fessiers. Quand il eut atteint le plan du métro, réseau complexe de lignes multicolores, telles les veines et la paume saignante de quelques Christ cubiques, il établit son trajet. Il descendrait à la 49e rue, prendrait le train nord, s'arrêterait à Union Square et de là se rendrait à pied dans le 14e pour aller frapper à la porte du capitaine Anthony Van Horn de la marine marchande brésilienne. Ensuite, il ne lui resterait plus qu'à embarquer sur le cargo Valparaiso, Valparaiso, et à conduire Dieu à son tombeau. Il trouva une place assise entre un Coréen ridé, tenant un cactus en pot sur ses genoux, et une séduisante femme noire ballonnée dans une robe de maternité. Pour Thomas Occam, de la CJ, le métro new-yorkais offrait un avant-goût du royaume des cieux. Un côtoiement d'Africains et d'Asiatiques, d'Arabes et d'Hispaniques, de gentils et de Juifs, toutes les frontières abolies, les démarcations effacées, tous les hommes affiliés à l'universelle et indivisible Église, au corps mystique du Christ. Une vérité pour le moins éloignée de ce que prouvait la demi-douzaine de photographies dans son attaché-caisse. Il n'y avait pas de royaume céleste, pas de corps mystique, car Dieu et ses dépendances diverses étaient morts. L'Italie avait été différente. En Italie, tout le monde se ressemblait, tout le monde avait l'air italien. L'Église traverse une crise grave. Ainsi commençait la supplique énigmatique que lui avait adressée le Saint-Siège, sous la forme d'un fax arrivé au département de physique de l'université de Fordham. Mais quelle sorte de crise? Spirituelle, politique, financière? La missive ne le disait pas. Grave, elle était assez pour que le siège presse urgemment Thomas d'annuler ses cours à venir et prenne le premier avion en partance pour Rome. Il avait télé un taxi à l'aéroport et dit au chauffeur de le conduire à la Compagnie de Jésus. Être un jésuite à Rome et ne pas recevoir la communion à l'église mère de la société, c'était comme être un physicien à Berne et ne pas passer à l'Institut national. Ce qu'il avait fait lors de son dernier voyage à Genève à l'occasion de la réunion du Conseil européen pour la recherche nucléaire. Il avait pris un jour de congé pour faire le pèlerinage à Berne et s'était même agenouillé devant le bureau en bois de rose sur lequel Albert Einstein avait rédigé en 1903 sur l'électrodynamique des corps en mouvement, mémoire célébrant divinement le mariage de la lumière avec la matière, de la matière avec l'espace, de l'espace avec le temps. Alors, Thomas communia, but le sang, mangea la chair, et s'en fut à son rendez-vous avec Tullio Di Luca à l'hôtel Rita Regia, où le secrétaire aux affaires ecclésiastiques extraordinaires l'accueillit sans chaleur. Flegmatique comme la lune, et comme elle la face morne et grillée, Monseigneur Di Luca invita Thomas à dîner à l'élégantissime ristorante du Rita Regia, où leur conversation ne dépassa jamais les publications de Thomas, surtout Mécanique de la grâce, réconciliation révolutionnaire de la physique post-newtonienne avec l'Eucharistie. Quand Thomas regarda Di Luca dans les yeux et lui demanda quelle était cette crise grave, le cardinal lui répondit qu'ils avaient rendez-vous le lendemain matin à 9h tapantes avec le Saint-Père.
J'ai écrit ça, pas mal.
Voilà, donc je vous encourage vivement, enfin, si vous ne l'avez pas déjà fait, à vous régaler avec la trilogie de Jéhovah.
Chaque moment a une cruelle ou sympathique. Je suis atheiste, humaniste, mais je ne suis pas un atheiste comme Richard Dawkins. Je suis atheiste comme philosophe français, André Sponville. You know, Sponville says he would never say that he knows God does not exist. He would merely say he has reasons to believe God does not exist. But I am a mere mortal. I cannot ultimately answer for the universe. Je suis un atheiste peut-être comme Spinoza, peut-être, ou Pierre Bordage dans le monde de la science-fiction. Pierre Bordage, il commence
Pas le mystique. You're not a mystic, though.
Le Pierre de mystique, non, je n'ai pas un mystique. Mais Pierre était presque en curé. Il est presque en prêtre. He almost took holy orders, and then.
But
Dans le
Erasmus as well.
Yes, right, Erasmus.
Yeah,
That's
because
right.
he's
Erasmus.
the
He's the
most
character.
the
Remember, he's a
hero
character
of
in the book.
Yes, and dans l'Arche de Darwin, il y a des time travelers. Most of the book is historical fiction, taking place around 1850
Gregor Mendel.
in the
Yeah,
in the New World, in the South America.
Quixote.
But there's some time travelers who show up at a hashish den in Constantinople, kind of salon des drogues. And parmi ces visiteurs is Théâtre de Chardin. And he's a fascinating thinker, and I tried to take his ideas seriously and present them honestly, even though I don't agree with them. But I admire him because he was at once a person of the church. I mean, it was his calling, and I can't speak to anybody's mystical or supernatural experiences, but he was also adamant defender of Darwin and believed in every dimension of materialist evolution.
But that's one of the things that I think are quite fascinating as well in your writings is the Godet trilogy is really something that is contemporary or futuristic, and the writing, the style, the material you use, the kind of sentences are contemporary or futuristic. When you are writing the Last Witchfinder, The Last Witchfinder, Le Dernier Chasseur de Sorcières, which maybe we will have a word on that, but which is part of it, I think, is a kind of celebration of the beauty of the first novel of John Barth, en français le courtier en tabac, le courtier de tabac.
Sackweed Factor.
Sackweed Factor.
Yeah.
And
the tobacco.
but it's really then it's really very early 18th century, late 17th century or early 18th century, because it's between the last Witchcraft Act in the UK and the new Witchcraft Act of 1731, which marks legally the end of witchcraft thinking in legal terms. But until 1731, in the UK, you had a legal basis to condemn people as witches. And it's one particularly clever and fun way of describing the way that led from the Witchcraft Act of
1604, I think. 1604.
And a little
parliamentary
to
witchcraft.
Is one. That's and the writing is totally different. It might the thematics, some of the things, some of the considerations on religion are obviously probably coming from the same person, but it might have been written by somebody entirely different, because it's really shaping the writing to the purpose of the book. And it's still the case with Hiroshima n'aura pas lieu. I don't remember the English.
Shambling towards Hiroshima.
Shambling comme monstre, comme Godzilla. Il n'y a pas un mot en français pour Shambling.
Because-
pas mot exactement.
But it's a poem to Yeats.
Because-
Shambling.
So
Yeah.
Phase one is, and we'll have a word on that, is really also a celebration of the power of the CinemaScope, but it's something crazy as well, because just on the last days or months of the Second World War, after Iwo Jima, Okinawa, of course, the American military and political leadership think that invading Japan will be an horrible butchery for everybody, but especially for the American soldiers, which are the main concern, of course. And so there are secret projects. One is well known, it's the Manhattan Project with the A bomb and the H bomb. And another one, which is far less known, is I forgot the
The
thing.
Knickerbocker Project.
The
It's another,
Comme
it's another
c'est
name for
autre
New
nom
York.
pour New York.
For
The
New York.
Knickerbocker
Exactly.
It's the old
project
Dutch for New York.
is
Yeah.
about is a biological warfare project, because some scientists, it's not a spoiler because you will know that after 25 pages, but some scientists devised huge fire-breathing lizards
Mhm.
that can be beached on Japan soil, and then that's finished. You don't have to risk one life of an American soldier.
Weapon biologique.
The lizard will do the job. And so that project is going its way. People are working on Manhattan in where they are working in, Alamogordo and all that. And people in Arizona are working on, in Nevada, are working on Knickerbocker. And for various reasons, at one key moment in the project, but it's the very beginning, they need a real specialist, a cinema star in special effects, because they need something. I will let you discover if you didn't read it. And it's written like totally different. You don't have anything of that 18th century
Archaic
sense of the
style,
sentence and all that. It's really something like it's made by Hollywood people, for Hollywood people, for specialists of B-series movies or various exploitation movies. And people are really living in that universe and know everything, and they are speaking like that. And the main the narrator, because what we are reading is some kind of long letter or memoir, is letting, for reasons you can discover only at the end.
To suicide.
But it's something totally, and again, the form is totally following the purpose.
Contemporary, I guess. Yeah, c'est romans et dans une langue archaic. I did a lot of research into the Restoration era. I led a
For the Witchfinder, yeah.
Angleterre
for the Société.
Le dernier chasseur de sorcières, mais pour Hiroshima n'aurait pas eu beaucoup de recherches dans le monde des films de horreur. Les films de horreur de Hollywood, parce que mon héros, le protagoniste, est un acteur.
Il aime bien ces films, obviously. He loves them. Yeah.
Il prend les rôles
Universal.
de vampire,
Yeah, right,
loup-garou, un peu comme Lon Chaney Jr. So il prend les vêtements d'un grand lizard pour délégation japonaise. And the idea, Japanese. And the United States Navy, they hope that the delegation from Japan will be so terrified by this demonstration. The lizard can breathe fire, and he destroys a model city, comme le livre.
Le maître des miniatures.
Yeah,
Exactly.
de miniature. Because the Navy really has created these biological monsters, but he's demonstrating.
Yeah.
Oh, there's also a swarm of them that are dwarfs. So
They just say that there are some problems in collateral damages in their use.
And
So they will prefer if they can make only the demonstration and not have to use
yes,
it.
yes, it's they want the Japanese to sue for peace, and actually, I find when one writes an historical novel, the actual facts of past events, comment dit-on en français, they play into your hands. It happens that the assistant to the Secretary of War under Harry Truman, qui a fait la décision de tomber les bombes sur Hiroshima et Nagasaki, il a dit, James, quel est le nom de le secrétaire de
I can't
guerre?
remember his name, but it doesn't matter.
Il a dit, Président Truman, il faut que nous avons une démonstration
From the
pour les
bomb.
Japonais
of the
parce
bomb.
que le bombe est trop terrible.
But not for the
The
Japanese, for the
United
Soviets
Sta-
actually.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
The
yeah.
United States will never be able to recover from the shame, the haunt of being the first nation to commit
That's right. We haven't.
mass murder,
Yeah.
atomic mass murder. And to this day,
Yeah, we have not recovered from it.
And
it's
that's
the only
yeah.
time civilians.
And that's
Yeah.
one of the elements that we find again in Blameless in Abaddon. In one of the arguments used is about Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well.
Yeah.
That's something, of course.
Wait, yes, a connection. I never thought of that. You're right.
And I will say a few words about Galapagos Regain, so L'Arche de Darwin. It's something which is amazing as well because, but I will use that as a transition to speak of playwrights and actresses, which is something very important, I think. In the Galapagos Regain, you have something we are mid 19th century, and in that universe, of course, Charles Darwin exists, and he has been already traveling with the Beagle, but most of his philosophical discoveries, not the biological ones, most of the biology has been published in the kind of Société Savante, which are clearly distinctive of the 19th century, early 19th century in science. But the origin of species has not been published yet. And all the trick, but it's also the 21st 40 pages on the 50, on 500 and more.
Right,
so
part of
I think
spoilers.
it's a small spoiler, but there is an actress, a play actress, nice girl, smart, but mostly uneducated, but very resourceful. That is. She lost her job. She lose her job because, unfortunately, at one of the plays she was present on stage, some socialist activists are causing some trouble, and because of her, of one thing she said, by changing a little bit of the official text of the play, not much, but sufficient little bit. And then she cannot work anymore in anywhere in London. That she's blacklisted, like when you're 1.5 centuries before McCarthyism,
Yeah.
she's already unable to work. So she's looking for a job, and she finds a job as assistant gardener at Darwin's place, where she's tend to lizards, birds, tortoises, everything Darwin has in his botanical and biological garden. And then she hears discussions between Darwin and his French scientists about the origin of species. And parallel to that, her father is in forced work, travaux forcés, je sais plus comment on dit ça en anglais.
Workhouse.
In
Workhouse.
workhouse, because in the British law at that time, when you were indebted and you were declared officially legally poor, indigent, and then you have to be put with a special uniform in a workhouse when you could eventually repay a small fraction of your debt that you will. That would be your, not punishment, but your social place. And her father is there, and he has a debt of something like 2,000 pounds, which is huge. And it happens that there is a contest made by rich, noble, famous people, a small society of 3 religious men and 3 men or women and 3 atheists, and they have a contest where they put a prize of 10,000 pounds for the first person that would make a convincing proof of existence or inexistence of God. And the first winner takes all. And so she does that, and she thinks that if she's able to put something around the unpublished work of Darwin about the origin of species, she can demonstrate the inexistence of God, take the 10,000 pounds, and free her father. And so that's the very beginning of the book, and then I let you imagine what can happen when you begin with that. Because, of course, she will have to travel to the Galapagos to bring some samples.
Darwin won't let her borrow, emprunter les animaux de son petit zoo, garden zoologique.
We
Jardin des
voyage
animaux.
a down house, and there's a very large lawn grass where it could be perfect
Where
spot
this
for the
Dôme
the hot house for the speed.
pour les animaux, pour les
For
tortes, et les
conservatoire.
oiseaux
Yeah.
exotiques, et les autres les reptiles aquatiques.
So it's an incredible philosophical travel, and it's a double philosophical travel, but I won't reveal the other travel, because while there is a travel to the Galapagos, there is also another travel to the Mount Ararat by competitors for the prize.
C'est un conte de deux couettes.
Two quests.
Yeah, two quests.
Two quests. I'm something of a écrivain des pièces de théâtre manquées. But in trying to write plays, I think I learned how to present arguments, philosophical arguments, and political arguments in a way that's terse, entertaining, and theatrical. Because you were saying earlier, these books, when they're at their best, don't degenerate into sermons or college lectures. Ils ne sont pas secs.
Aride.
Yeah,
Aride. Seconds for wine. Yeah.
I think there's no incompatibility between maintaining the integrity of an idea, of an argument for the existence of God, or an argument for the evil of God, la mal de Dieu. No incompatibility between that and le humor, satire, and the principle of pleasure, as Freud would put it.
Because behind Darwin and the idea, which is central, you are mobilizing such tremendous literary forces, and because we are in the midst of 19th century, you are using literary adventure and proto science fiction, and it's full of the atmosphere of Jules Verne, of Herman Melville, of Joseph Conrad, and while it is very serious, because the discussions between the people, and they are serious but light, not as you told. At one moment, the part of an expedition is in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon, and they have still to cross the Andes to be on the other coast of South America. So it's but they are stuck in Manaus for a few weeks, and they have discussions, of course, between them. But the discussions are very witty, with a lot of irony in it, and a lot of untold, because at one moment it's not necessary to liberate. We begin at that stage in the book to know enough of the characters. It's not necessary for the author to write everything. So even if it's adventure and romance and scientific romance in the 19th century, it's very smart in his writing and in his it's very modern or postmodern in its way of using the narration, and that's a very strange combination to have Jules Verne and Joseph Conrad in a discrete or postmodern treatment, but without putting all the postmodern arsenal on the scene. We're keeping it quiet and discreet.
C'est peut-être une combinaison, fusion de Jules Verne, de Autour du monde en 80 jours, et Candide de Voltaire. That light touch, I prize the drollery of Voltaire and the acidic satire. And he was peut-être, Voltaire n'est pas un atheiste, il était un déiste peut-être, but a great critic of organized religion.
I would like to just to have one more or less last question on actresses and your actress characters, and on cinema, and on Caligari, who is forthcoming in France, already published in the US. But I would like to read only the first few lines of Hiroshima no Rappalieu. Because it will not spoil anything that we don't have already spoiled. But it gives the tone, the tonality is so different from the Godet trilogy or from the Last Witchfinder that I think it's interesting to have that in mind. So. Difficile de dire si ces mémoires passeront pour le mot d'adieu le plus bavard jamais laissé par un suicidé, ou me permettront d'éviter l'abysse. Seul le temps le dira. Un intervalle de temps en vérité très précis, les 25 heures qui s'étirent depuis ce moment-ci, dimanche 28 octobre 1984 à 11h06 du matin, et mon départ prévu demain par la navette de midi pour l'aéroport. Pour l'instant, la seule manière de fuir cet hôtel stérile de Baltimore serait de sauter par la fenêtre, ce qui me paraît assez tentant. Il suffirait d'ouvrir la fenêtre coulissante, de gagner la terrasse et de m'abandonner aux 30 mètres de vide donnant sur le parking. Les apparences sont trompeuses. La lecture de mon histoire n'implique pas que j'ai perdu patience et pris cette navette. La déduction correcte serait que j'ai glissé mon manuscrit dans une enveloppe festonnée de timbres à l'adresse de Rachel Bishop, mon agente à New York, puis laissé le paquet devant ma porte avec un mot priant le directeur de l'hôtel de le glisser dans la boîte aux lettres la plus proche. « Es-tu en train de me lire, Rachel ? Je t'aime, ma chérie, tu es la meilleure agente que j'ai jamais eue. En supposant que tu déniches quelqu'un capable de déchiffrer mon écriture, tu as toute liberté pour transcrire ces pages, trouve-leur un titre, Le jour du lézard peut-être, ou Révolte chez les ploucs, et pourquoi pas Hiroshima n'aura pas lieu. Et vends le bébé à Doubleday pour une grasse et confortable avance, te laissant un légitime 10%, le reste revenant à Darlene. Oui, Rachel, tu tiens peut-être un best-seller entre tes mains. Et il porte la marque ultime de l'authenticité, le saut de son auteur dans l'oubli, à la fois son chant du cygne et sa disparition. Il est vrai que la NSA pourrait bloquer sa publication, mais s'ils allaient en justice, le juge les débouterait, notamment quand il serait fait mention d'iguane cracheur de feu. Alors, il y a that way of, in many pages you're writing, you are putting a lot of in coda venenum, when
Beaucoup de what?
in coda venenum, that the last sentence put a totally different light on everything that was
Yes.
written. That was, I think, the case in many things. So my last question, more or less, would be why so two of your most powerful and lovely characters are two actresses, Nora in The Eternal Footman and Miss Bathurst in Galapagos Regained. So,
well, as I said, theater or playwriting was my first calling. And I think from my failed attempts to write plays, I did learn how to create dialogue that was entertaining, but also philosophically sound or even complex. And I love to create female characters. I think it's important for an author to have some distance, some perspective. And by flipping genders, it helped me to not write mere autobiography.
But you identify with these characters.
Not to do mere journalism. But I identify. But Chloe Flaubert. Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Chloe Bathurst, c'est moi. Nora Burkhart, c'est moi. Mais with a certain perspective. So the energy of theater, the magic of the live performance, is the closest thing for me to a religious experience in a church, but it's a aesthetic experience in a theater.
Well, starts off as a religious experience.
We went to the opera aujourd'hui.
Yeah.
And it was for me like being in this Baroque, grand Baroque opera.
Yeah.
It was like being in a cathedral. And so I get energy from that, and also energy from the culture populaire. Oui, c'est un hommage de roman de Godzilla. Oui, j'aime les films de Godzilla. Writing this book was a great excuse to revisit all of these wonderfully ridiculous monster movies. Although I discovered the original Godzilla, black and white film, Gojira. Not the American, the version pour les États-Unis était un film maudit, mais l'original, japonais film original, c'est pour moi un des grands films contre-guerre. Je pense que it's as strong as a film as All Quiet on the Western Front, as an anti-war film.
It's a major anti-war film.
or the one of the first films of Stanley Kubrick. What is his film de la guerre?
What
Past
Past of Glory.
It's de gloire.
Yeah. You'll see. I think the aspect of postmodernism that I embrace is the lowering of barriers between high culture, haute culture, and culture populaire. It's very energizing for les écrivains comme moi, and mon ami Jonathan Lethem, and Michael Chambon, with his love of bande dessinée.
So maybe one last one about the next book for the French in French. So Caligari. It's not about cinema, but cinema plays an important part in it. So.
Well, it's in the postmodern thinkers, critics could say, mon roman, the Asylum, like pour les fous, the Asylum of Dr. Caligari, c'est en conversation avec le film de Robert Wine, le cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The writers of that movie always said that they intended to create an allegory so that the hypnotist mountebank Caligari represents the forces, the political and military authorities that sent so many young men, German young men, and from all over Europe, really, French young men, British young men, off to die in the trenches in Flanders and La France. And the sleepwalker, the somnambulist, represents the soldiers, the victims. So in my retelling of Caligari, Caligari is a sorcerer and a hypnotist, but he's also an artist, and he creates a painting, a peinture, immense, grand peinture that has the power to seduce soldiers into becoming fighting machines, and they lose free will. They lose any compassion for the soldiers on the other side. So Caligari has created a kind of war machine with paint. And so I'm literalizing the allegorical interpretation of the film. And all of that is, for some readers will get that and others won't. It's not that important, really, to know that. I think my novella stands on its own. It's just another very strange James Morrow novel full of comedy and bizarre, surrealistic events and outrageous opinions.
So thank you so much, James, for being accepted that invitation and shared with us those magic. Not magic thinking, because there is no magical thinking, never, at the contrary, but to the inspiration that made probably of that those books among the nicest, most interesting reading and thought experiments as is a vocation, actually. So thank you very much.
Je vous en prie. Merci. C'était merci. Moi, c'est une expérience très agréable. Merci à vous aussi.